The year was 1975, and Cambodia stood at a crossroads of history. After years of civil war and US bombings, the country was exhausted, broken, and desperate for stability. When the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh on April 17th, many welcomed them as liberators, unaware of the nightmare that had just begun. Pol Pot, a man once known as Saloth Sar, envisioned a radical utopia. His dream was to return Cambodia to a purely agrarian society, one without cities, money, or class distinctions. To him, modernity was corruption, and intellectuals were enemies. Anyone who wore glasses, spoke French, or held an education became a target. The takeover of Phnom Penh was swift and brutal. Within days, the Khmer Rouge emptied the city, forcing millions of residents to march into the countryside. Sick, elderly, and children were driven at gunpoint, told that the move was temporary. In truth, it was the beginning of mass extermination through starvation, labor, and execution. The new rulers called their state Democratic Kampuchea, but democracy was only in name. In reality, Cambodia had become a prison without walls. Pol Pot and his inner circle ruled through fear, surveillance, and absolute loyalty to the cause. The people were told they belonged to Angkar, the all-seeing, faceless organization. Life in the countryside quickly turned into a nightmare. Families were torn apart as the regime separated husbands from wives, parents from children. To Pol Pot, family ties were dangerous. Only loyalty to Angkar mattered. Villagers were forced into collective farms, where they labored endlessly under the scorching sun. Rice became the symbol of survival. The regime demanded impossible quotas from the fields, yet the farmers themselves starved. Workers were given only watery gruel, often no more than a ladle of rice porridge a day. Malnutrition spread like wildfire, killing thousands silently before bullets ever touched them. Suspicion poisoned the air. Anyone accused of stealing food, hoarding, or showing disobedience was branded a traitor. The Khmer Rouge believed enemies lurked everywhere, hidden spies, intellectuals, or those loyal to the old government. Paranoia became an excuse for mass killings, and no one felt safe. Children were not spared. Instead of being protected, they were indoctrinated to serve as loyal soldiers and informants. Young boys and girls spied on their parents, reporting the slightest criticism of Angkar. In some villages, it was children who pointed out traitors, sending their own families to death. Religion was erased from daily life. Buddhist monks were defrocked, temples desecrated, and scriptures destroyed. The Khmer Rouge declared that belief in the divine was weakness, and the only god was Angkar. Centuries of tradition were uprooted in months, leaving people spiritually shattered and adrift. Prisons sprouted across the country, each a silent chamber of horror. The most infamous was S21, also known as Tuol Sleng, a former school turned into a torture center. Once inside, few ever left alive. Prisoners were beaten, electrocuted, drowned, and mutilated until they confessed to crimes they never committed. Confession was the Khmer Rouge's obsession. Prisoners were forced to admit to being CIA agents, Vietnamese spies, or traitors plotting to destroy Angkar. These confessions were recorded in meticulous detail, even though the accusations were absurd. After confession, death awaited, often execution in nearby fields. The killing fields themselves became vast graves. Victims were marched to open pits, blindfolded, and executed with crude weapons to save bullets. Bamboo sticks, hoes, and hammers became tools of death. The sound of revolutionary songs blared from loudspeakers, drowning out screams so villages wouldn't hear. Night after night, the earth swallowed bodies. Some pits filled with hundreds, others with thousands. Babies were not spared. Many were killed by having their skulls smashed against trees, while mothers wept helplessly. These sights became symbols of Cambodia's unimaginable suffering. The Khmer Rouge's cruelty was not only physical, but psychological. Survivors recalled the constant fear of saying the wrong word, smiling at the wrong time, or appearing too weak. Any small act could bring suspicion, and suspicion meant death. Silence became the only way to live another day. Pol Pot rarely appeared in public, yet his presence haunted every corner of life. He was a shadow, a voice in propaganda broadcasts, a distant but all-powerful figure. His word was law, and his ideology demanded that Cambodia erase its past, to create a new future of Year Zero. Year Zero meant starting over as if history had never existed. Schools, markets, money and private property, all abolished. Doctors, teachers and artists were executed. Even wearing glasses became dangerous, because it suggested literacy, and literacy was a crime. Cambodia's brightest minds vanished in blood and silence. As months turned into years, famine deepened. The people grew skeletal, too weak to work, yet forced into labor from dawn until dusk. Diseases like malaria and dysentery tore through the countryside. With no medicine and no hospitals, death became a daily companion. For the Khmer Rouge, this suffering was not failure. It was purification. Pol Pot believed only the strong, the loyal, and the obedient deserved to live. The rest were expendable. He once declared that it was better to kill 10 innocent people than let one enemy survive. Villages turned into zones of despair. The sound of shovels digging mass graves became routine. Survivors remembered the stench of death lingering in the air, carried by the wind from nearby fields. Even those still alive felt as though they were already ghosts, trapped in a land of endless mourning. Foreigners were cut off from Cambodia, and the outside world saw only fragments of what was happening. Pol Pot's regime guarded its secrets well, presenting itself as a disciplined revolutionary movement. Few could imagine that behind closed borders, a genocide of nearly 2 million people was unfolding. By the late 1970s, whispers of rebellion stirred in the countryside. Some survivors clung to hope that the nightmare could not last forever. Yet for millions already gone, that hope had come too late. The killing fields had become Cambodia's most terrifying reality. The machinery of terror in Cambodia grew more precise as the Khmer Rouge consolidated control. Every region, every village, was assigned cadres who enforced the will of Angkar. These officials were often young, barely teenagers, but armed with rifles and unshakable zeal. Fear became the currency of survival. People learned to speak in whispers, to hide emotions, to erase the past from memory. A careless word could bring death, even a sigh of frustration mistaken for disloyalty. The eyes of Angkar were everywhere, and betrayal lurked in every shadow. Tuol Sleng, or S21, became the darkest symbol of Pol Pot's paranoia. What had once been a schoolyard for children now reeked of blood, sweat, and decay. Prisoners were chained to iron beds, their screams echoing through corridors once filled with laughter. Interrogations at S21 were endless. Men and women were beaten with electrical wires, suffocated with plastic bags, or suspended by their arms until bones snapped. Torture was not just punishment. It was ritual, designed to break the spirit and extract false confessions. Every confession was recorded carefully by the prison staff. Victims listed names of family, friends, and neighbors, often under unbearable pain. These names were added to new arrest lists, ensuring that terror spread like wildfire across the country. Guilt was contagious and innocence meant nothing. The guards themselves were often teenage recruits, trained to see prisoners as enemies of the revolution. They carried out orders without hesitation, believing mercy to be betrayal. For them, cruelty became a test of loyalty, and hesitation could cost their own lives. Not even Khmer Rouge leaders were safe. Pol Pot's paranoia consumed his own ranks, and purges became frequent. High-ranking officials were accused of betrayal, dragged to S21, and executed. Those who once served him faithfully were erased as easily as peasants in the fields. Outside the prisons, the countryside became a vast labor camp. Villagers were forced to build dams, dig canals, and farm rice under impossible quotas. The soil was dry and infertile, yet the regime demanded record harvests. When targets were not met, workers were punished as saboteurs. Food grew scarcer with each season. Children's bellies swelled from malnutrition, and parents watched helplessly as their little ones wasted away. Stealing even a handful of rice was punishable by death. Hunger became an enemy more merciless than any soldier. Night executions haunted the villages. People were summoned without warning, taken away under the cover of darkness. Families never saw them again, only hearing the dull thud of clubs striking skulls in distant fields. The silence of the survivors was a survival instinct. The killing fields multiplied across the country. Graves filled faster than the earth could cover them. Skulls and bones jutted from the soil after heavy rains, a grim reminder that the ground itself had become a cemetery. Death was not hidden. It was everywhere. Pregnant women, the elderly, and infants were not spared. In the eyes of Angkar, all lives were expendable. Women were raped before execution, while babies were slaughtered to prevent future enemies. Such cruelty stripped Cambodia of generations in a matter of years. Meanwhile, propaganda saturated daily life. Loudspeakers blasted revolutionary songs and speeches, drowning out cries of anguish. Villagers were forced to attend meetings where they shouted slogans and pledged loyalty. But behind their raised fists, they trembled, knowing one slip could end in execution. The Khmer Rouge portrayed themselves as saviors of the nation, cleansing Cambodia of corruption and foreign influence. Yet even as millions died, they insisted it was sacrifice for a brighter future. Reality and lies merged until truth itself was impossible to find. Some prisoners attempted escape, but few succeeded. Those captured faced public executions designed to terrify others into obedience. Families of escapees were often killed in retribution, ensuring that fear paralyzed any thought of resistance. Tuol Sleng continued to swallow victims by the thousands. Each prisoner was photographed before torture began, their faces frozen in fear or defiance. These haunting portraits, meticulously catalogued, became evidence of a regime obsessed with documenting its own crimes. The guards at S21 developed routines that blurred humanity. They shackled, beat, and killed daily, numbed to suffering. Some confessed years later that they feared becoming prisoners themselves, so they obeyed without question. In this world, morality had no place. The regime's ideology seeped into every crack of life. Marriage was arranged by Angkar, with couples forced to wed in mass ceremonies. Love and choice were outlawed, replaced with duty to the revolution. Even intimacy became controlled by the state. Pol Pot's speeches painted a twisted vision of purity. He spoke of Cambodia returning to the soil, of creating a nation of farmers untouched by modern corruption. To many, these words were madness, yet they echoed from radios as if divine law. Children carried rifles instead of toys. They marched in parades, reciting slogans with hollow voices. Some were ordered to execute prisoners as proof of loyalty, their innocence destroyed in moments of brutality. The future of Cambodia was being forged in blood and fear. In the fields, laborers collapsed daily. Those too weak to rise were left behind, abandoned like broken tools. Work did not stop for illness, hunger, or grief. The land demanded bodies, and Angkar demanded obedience until death. The Khmer Rouge claimed equality, but leaders lived in hidden comfort. While peasants starved, Pol Pot and his circle feasted in secrecy, guarded by soldiers. Their hypocrisy only deepened the suffering of the people who toiled endlessly with nothing to eat. Whispers of rebellion flickered in villages, though speaking them aloud was suicide. Some hid scraps of food, some prayed in secret despite the ban on religion. Survival became resistance, and even a small act of defiance carried the weight of courage. By 1977, the death toll reached unimaginable numbers. Mass graves stretched across Cambodia like scars on the land. Yet Pol Pot remained unmoved, declaring the revolution a triumph. His delusion grew while the people sank deeper into despair. In the shadows, a new threat to the Khmer Rouge was rising. Cambodia's ancient rivalry with Vietnam simmered, and border clashes erupted. The same paranoia that fueled executions now pointed outward as Pol Pot prepared for war. Inside the killing fields, life was reduced to breath, fear, and silence. The regime's machinery of terror ground on relentlessly, devouring its own people. Cambodia had become a nation of graves, each one testifying to the nightmare still unfolding. By 1978, Cambodia was drowning in death and despair. The killing fields stretched across the land like an endless scar, and famine had hollowed the nation. Yet Pol Pot's obsession with purity and paranoia only grew stronger, consuming even his closest allies. The Khmer Rouge turned inward, purging thousands of their own cadres. Soldiers, commanders, even ministers were accused of treachery and dragged to Tuol Sleng. The prisons filled with the very men who once enforced the revolution, their confessions written in trembling hands before execution. Paranoia soon spread across the countryside. Villagers no longer trusted neighbors, siblings no longer trusted each other. A whispered word or suspicious glance was enough to bring death. Fear had become so thick that it replaced the air itself, suffocating the nation. Meanwhile, Pol Pot turned his gaze toward Vietnam. Centuries of rivalry burned deep, and he believed the Vietnamese were plotting to destroy Cambodia. Cross-border raids escalated, with Khmer Rouge soldiers slaughtering civilians in Vietnamese villages, fueling a war that would seal their fate. Inside Cambodia, starvation reached catastrophic levels. Families boiled roots, leaves, and insects just to survive. Children cried themselves to sleep with empty stomachs, their voices fading into silence as hunger took their lives. The land, once fertile, had been reduced to dust and graves. Buddhist monks, once the soul of Cambodian life, had nearly vanished. Temples stood abandoned, their statues broken and defaced. Religion had been erased, leaving people without comfort, without prayers, without hope. The nation's spiritual heart had been torn out. Tuol Sleng remained a nightmare that never slept. Prisoners, many of them children, were shackled in rows, their hollow eyes staring into darkness. Torturers worked with mechanical precision, knowing that mercy was punishable by death. Every confession ended the same way, with a march to the fields. The killing fields themselves grew louder with silence. Heavy rains unearthed bones, skulls, and clothing, turning the countryside into a macabre landscape. Survivors remembered walking past pits where the soil still moved, as if the dead were struggling to breathe. Pol Pot, hidden from the people, continued to preach the success of Year Zero. He declared Cambodia pure and strong, even as millions lay buried beneath its soil. His voice carried on radios, a phantom ruler disconnected from the suffering he had unleashed. By late 1978, Vietnam had lost patience. The massacres along their border demanded retribution. A massive invasion force swept into Cambodia, determined to end Pol Pot's reign of terror. The Khmer Rouge army, weakened and starving, could not withstand the assault. Phnom Penh fell quickly in January 1979. When Vietnamese troops entered the capital, they found a ghost city, silent and shattered. Streets once filled with life were abandoned, and the few survivors staggered like shadows, too weak to rejoice at liberation. The gates of Tuol Sleng were thrown open. Inside, the soldiers found rooms filled with shackled corpses, torture devices, and the haunting photographs of thousands of victims. The air reeked of death, and the walls whispered with the screams of the murdered. In the countryside, survivors emerged cautiously from labor camps. Skeletal, broken, and traumatized, they searched for family members who would never return. Villages discovered their loved ones in mass graves, mourning over bones when there were no bodies left to bury. Yet even in defeat, the Khmer Rouge did not vanish. Pol Pot and his loyalists retreated into the jungle, clinging to power in remote strongholds. From there, they fought a guerrilla war for years, refusing to surrender, refusing to face the weight of their crimes. The international community was slow to respond. Some nations, still entangled in Cold War politics, recognized the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate rulers for years after their fall. Justice for the dead came late, delayed by the machinery of global power. Survivors bore the heaviest burden. They carried memories of starvation, torture, and the loss of entire families. Many were haunted by guilt for living when others perished, their dreams filled with faces of the dead. Healing seemed impossible in a land built on graves. The killing fields remained as silent witnesses. Thousands of skulls were collected from the pits, stacked in memorials as a testimony to the horror. Each one told a story, of a life cut short, of a family destroyed, of a nation scarred beyond recognition. Cambodia's children inherited the trauma of their parents. Orphans wandered through ruins, their childhood stolen. Generations grew up in the shadow of bones, learning to live with the ghosts of a past that refused to rest. Pol Pot himself lived in hiding for years. Shielded by jungle and loyal soldiers, he evaded justice until his death in 1998. He died without trial, without confession, without remorse, his crimes carved only in the memories of those who survived him. The Khmer Rouge's dream of Year Zero had ended, but at the cost of nearly 2 million lives. The fields, the prisons, the silence, All remained as scars carved into Cambodia's soul. For those who lived, every breath carried the weight of the dead. Please subscribe for more interesting content.